Hello, everyone. So, we are on the second day of class. We're preparing for it. And as you guys know, the topic of the personal narrative that you're going to be focusing on for today is image analysis, which is what your reading was for today. So, just going over some of the goals that we have for class. And for this lesson, we're going to be looking at narrative structure. I know we kind of set that up yesterday in class. A really big portion of the lesson will be just looking at the structure of how to make a thesis for a narrative. And then the third thing will be to look at models and to brainstorm for your own writing. So let's begin with this conversation that I always use when I introduce the narrative, because I think a lot of students have these questions that I've presented here that have to do with what is the difference between writing a narrative essay and a short story. I have students saying, I'm not a creative writing major. I didn't sign up for this sort of class. I thought I was just going to be doing research papers. And, basically what they're asking is, why am I even doing this? So I just want to talk about 3 reasons why we begin the semester focused on narrative writing. The first is that it allows for us to focus on foundational essay structure, so that can just kind of be taken care of once we get into adding on research components. You'll already have a foundation in format and structure for a college essay. The second is it still allows you to work on analytical skills, right? Even though you're not analyzing research evidence, you do have evidence, which is the narrative or the story itself. And then the third is that focusing on vivid and creative imagery is a good way to begin the semester by showing my expectation that you work on vocabulary expansion and developing or crafting your own unique voice as a writer. So these are 3 things that are really useful for a narrative essay, and there's something that extend it beyond just a piece of fiction writing that you would do for a short story. So, what I want to talk about first of all, and kind of break down after we just do this overall setup here, is narrative structure. Again, this is the whole point of this essay is just to go over basic foundational structure for an essay. So, the 3 parts of this paper and most papers um, are as follows. We have, first of all, an introduction, which has 3 parts as I describe it. We have creative context, which I'll get into later, a transition, and then, of course, the thesis. So these are things that we'll be looking for in models and that you'll be working toward in your own writing. Then, second, and kind of the main part of the paper, of course, is the body, which in the case of a narrative paper should include a beginning, middle, and end of a narrative. The standard is 3 paragraphs. I've seen people do a little bit more than that for this paper, but it makes a lot of sense if you have 3 parts to the story to separate that into 3 separate paragraphs. And then lastly, we have the conclusion, which is after your story has ended. And I like to emphasize that because some people think the end of the story is the end of the essay, but again, that's what makes us different from a piece of creative writing, is that you're analyzing it. The conclusion is looking for a bigger picture tied to your story. So we're going to go over each of these pieces one by one. Um, the first thing I want to do, and kind of the framework I'm using here, is looking at narrative structure based on, and all these different points that we're discussing based on the essay that we looked at in class yesterday by Smith, Under the Banner of New York. So I'm going to be going to it and kind of referencing some of these things, just because I begin the semester with that piece, since I think it's a really solid model of the structure and kind of the style that I'm asking you guys to aim for with this paper. So remember, just going back to what I set up, we have 3 elements that are included in the introduction, right? Creative context, transition, and thesis. The thesis is going to be our kind of main focus for this lesson, so I'm just going to go over the first 2 points here to conclude this initial video. So if we're looking at these 2 elements within the model paper or the model essay that we looked at in class yesterday, the creative context, as we discussed, right, but we didn't use this vocabulary, is setting up this concept of routines. So I have a quote here: cities have routines, and then it kind of leads to this statement after she describes a lot of routines from New York to say, today I discovered I am serving as a clock for others. So let me actually open that up on the website. I posted it here for you guys, even though we already looked at it, just because I think it's a really good model of exactly what it is that you guys should be working toward, right? So the idea of creative context is that you're not beginning already with your main content, right? It's just a way to get us thinking about the topic. But of course, this initial introduction is not already giving us the story. It's a narrative style still, which is not a requirement, but it's something that can work well. But it's just getting us to that main point, right? So the concept of routines is established right off the bat, and then we have this series of routines, right? All these different things that are going on. The idea of how you can see this concept of human clocks. They tell you where you are in relation to everything else in regard to the citizens that you pass daily in New York, right? She even says, I used to be able to discern whether or not we were late for school by the side of a particular movie star passing under the arch of Washington Square. So we have a very clear visual image that's giving us some context for our narrative that has to do with this idea of people crossing paths and functioning as clocks for each other, right? So all of this is happening, and then it gets into an even more interesting part. Today I discovered I am serving as a clock for others, right? And this is what I had on the slide. I always see you at 10 past 9 reading your book in the window of that cafe, and I'm like, she got a good routine. Also, I should read more. So now we get from the broader sense of New York City people to something even more focused, our author functioning as a clock in this routine world, right? And it's even more specific. So I like this idea of thinking about the introduction of the creative context as going from broad to narrower to narrower. The smaller that you can get that down, the easier it's going to be to develop your transition, right? And now for the transition, as I've stated here, we have this idea of such are our routines. So as I said here, the transition is basically a summary of what's come, of what she's already established, which we've already talked about. She uses the term routine many times, right? And then it's leading us into what's to come, which again will be a perfect setup for the thesis. So after all this story, we narrow it down, get to her personal experience, narrow it down, and here we go. Such are our routines. And so this transition is giving a little bit of commentary on what we've already seen here, and then it's a perfect setup for, okay, now here's my comment based on all these different things that I've been discussing and this creative context that I've established. So I really like the example here, and I think it's something for you guys to consider modeling, of how we begin the paper in just one paragraph with an interesting creative context and a very direct transition that's going to lead into the thesis. And the thesis is what your next video